I love comparing the difference between my culture back in Canada and the cultural experiences I have here in Germany. But so many of you have commented in the comment section, often saying, Jenna, you don't know what it's like to live here on the land. You don't know what it's like in the countryside. You're just comparing Düsseldorf to the rest of Germany, and that's not fair. Well, over the past 7 years living here in Germany, I definitely have had my fair share of experiences. I've had the amazing opportunity to travel to every single state here in Germany, every single capital city in each state, and a number of the neighboring villages. So I do have a little bit of experience regarding that topic, and I wanted you to know, I'm not just basing it all on Düsseldorf, but it definitely helps to have somebody who actually lives in a small town here in Germany to compare and to contrast the difference between living in a bigger city as an international versus living in a smaller town. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jenna. I have been living here in Germany since 2014, and over the past few years, I have built up a massive program called the Life in Germany Welcome Program that you can go check out at lifeingermany.com. If you're ready for this video, let me introduce you to our amazing guest today, Shaun from the Germany Experience podcast. He had me over on his podcast last year and I had so much fun. He has an amazing personality and he really understands, how to be an international, but also integrate here into Germany. If you're excited to watch this video, please don't forget to give me some support. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and don't forget to subscribe.
Thanks for inviting me, Jenna. It's great to be a guest on your YouTube channel. I am Shaun. I'm the host of the Germany Experience podcast, and I am originally from South Africa, but I've been living in Germany now for, I think it's 14 years. So I'm pretty much Germanized. I have a German passport and everything, but even after all this time, I still feel like an outsider. And yes, as you said, I live rurally. So what that means is I'm in middle Franconia, which is in Bavaria. You're not allowed to say that to Germans because they freak out because it's separate from Bavaria somehow. But anyway, 45 kilometers away from the nearest big city. Like if we're talking about a Nuremberg or Erlangen, which are the biggest metropolitan areas around here, I'm about 45 minutes away from that.
Wow, I didn't realize you were so far.
But of course, in Germany, it's a bit different to what I'm used to. Like in South Africa, rural and living rurally means that you're literally 400 kilometers away from any civilization.
So how, as an international, how on earth did you end up living rurally then rather than choosing a big city?
I don't know, somehow, because my wife and I were actually city people somehow. So the way it developed is in South Africa, the mindset is always people, when they earn enough money, when they've got a good job, you just buy a house. That's the way things work in South Africa. It's a little different in Germany. People don't like to buy. They generally prefer to rent. But in South Africa, we like to buy. And we wanted to buy a house when we knew we were going to be in Germany for a long time. So we started looking to buy in the city, which took about maybe one day of realizing there is no way we can afford those kinds of prices because you get very small living space and you pay exorbitant amounts for property. So then we started looking, okay, let's look at the Stadtrand, which is the city edges, let's say. Yeah. And we started looking there, and there it was a little cheaper, but still pretty pricey. And then we realized, wow, we need to look really further away from a city. And the place that we ended up looking at, we just went to look at it as a reference property because we thought this checks all of our boxes, except it's really far away from anything. But let's go and have a look at the house anyway, just to get an idea of what we wanted. And when we came into the house, it just felt like home immediately. Like the moment we stepped in, we were like, wow, this is home. We got into the car afterwards and we looked at each other and we were like, it kind of felt like home. There's always the thought in your mind, like, can we live in the countryside? I mean, it's quite a different aspect also from a foreigner's perspective out here. There's very few foreigners, if you want to put it that way, that live out rurally. So these were all things that we weighed up, but that's how we ended up out in the country, is we just fell in love with this house and we just thought, well, let's give it a try.
I think it takes real courage to be able to do that. Can you actually live on the countryside as a foreigner? You've been there for a while now, so I'm hoping the answer is yes.
And I think to give the broad answer to that question is you can, but there are some caveats, and the biggest one is that your German needs to be at a serviceable level. Unlike in a city where you could get by with a little bit of German and switching to English, out in the countryside there is very little English. The people can speak English, but they either don't want to because it's not required on a day-to-day basis, or they don't believe that their English is good enough to speak it. So I think the one biggest prerequisite of living very rurally is that your German needs to be good. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's going to be way more difficult than in a city.
Yeah, definitely. And because I live in the city and I've visited different smaller towns, and I feel like I get a mix of people there sometimes. In some small towns, I find them to be very unfriendly, and some they're like overly friendly, and I almost feel like I'm back in Canada. But what is it like for you guys? Are people friendly there?
Middle Franconia is a difficult thing. Franconians are very well known for being very unfriendly, is maybe the wrong word to use, but they're kind of closed, not cold, but just not very forthcoming, if I can put it that way. So it's quite a well-known thing, and it's definitely something that we've experienced, but we've come to understand what the locals are like. So the thing is, I think if I often try to think of it from a completely foreigner's perspective, new foreigner in this area, I think they would experience it as very unfriendly, but the people are actually warm and very helpful. There's I have the feeling out here that whenever we need help with anything, if we can ask neighbors, we can ask people down the street, and even people we don't know that well, and they will come and help us, and they will do it happily. They expect a pizza or a beer in return afterwards, but they do it, and it's like that blows me away. There's a very, very high willingness to help, and that's something that I value. But when it comes to making friends with them, like they could come here and help you put something up in your backyard or do something around the house, and then you have a pizza and a beer afterwards, but then afterwards, there's no friendship. There's no sort of development of that relationship. They just go back to their own lives. So that can be a bit tricky, especially for South Africans. And I think like Canadians, we're very, very friendly, very gregarious, open people, and we want to make connections and stuff. That's it doesn't work so well.
Funny enough, the last video I just published on YouTube, I was talking to another expat who lives here in the Düsseldorf area, close to me. And we had the same conversation. I think it's really no different in the city. The biggest difference you have is that it's easier to make friends because there's more internationals. And the most interesting thing that people mentioned, or that Germans specifically mentioned in the comments, was that we use the term friend very differently in the English language than they do here in Germany. And so a friend here is a friend for life, whereas a friend in Canada might be more of an acquaintance.
And the other thing about people here in the rural setting that makes it difficult to make friends as well is that a lot of the people here have been here for multiple generations. So their grandparents were here, their parents were here, and now they're here, and they've got children here, and they have a circle of friends that's quite broad, and they're all living locally. So they all know each other and they're friends with each other. And then you're the foreigner in this area, and it's not that they are unfriendly to you, but they don't need more friends. They've got all the friends that they need, and why would they struggle with the foreigner who's maybe has bad German or struggle sometimes to express themselves? It's just like, it's not that they're being unfriendly or unkind. It doesn't occur to them, like, why would we bother? We've got our own circle of friends. But having said that, that's obviously a generalization. We've come across several families here that we've become close friends with now over time. It's been 3 or 4 years, and I feel like now we've finally started making really good friends, how I would define friends, like family friends. That is a more deeper connection.
It takes a little while, but once you've developed that connection and that friendship, I think that's so important. Aside from friends, connecting or finding a way to connect to perhaps someone who can help you out, someone like a handyman per se, or because a lot of these services in the city can also be done in English. So what is it like in smaller towns? Like, you definitely can't do it in English.
You cannot do it in English, and your expectations have to be a little different out in the country, as what we've learned. Like I said, we lived in the city for a long time, and we'd already had complaints about service in Germany. It's not, it's not the friendliest like we would experience in South Africa, where the customer is king. That's not the case in Germany in general. But out here, it's very informal, I will put it that way. So there's a lot of businesses around here that do things like wall plastering or painting or gardening, garden work and things like that. but they're all sort of family businesses, or there's one guy that's doing it and he started his own little gewerbe, his own little business, and he's doing it. So it's all very informal. There's no things like people, receptionists answering phones or official websites or anything. You just phone a number. You hope that you reach the person. Very often I call a number and it's a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old answers the phone, their kid, and they say, no, Papa is not here right now. And then I'm like, can you ask him to call me back? I'm not going to leave a message with a 6-year-old for their father to call me back. So it's very, very informal. Then sometimes you do reach the right person, but then you make an appointment for them to come, which is very broad, and then they just don't show up. That for whatever reason, that we've had a few experiences like that they just don't show up. So it's very informal. We've learned to build that into our expectations a little. It's not a complaint of mine. It's just an observation of customer service out here is different because it's the family-run businesses, and those people generally are all busy in the cities anyway with bigger contracts.
I find it interesting you say that though, because we're in the middle of renovating. We also purchased a house. When we're hiring somebody to come and help us with the build, I'd say 9 times out of 10 they don't show up. And I thought that was a city thing because I assume that in the smaller towns you have a more one-on-one connection.
Yeah, I think that they do have push. It's just that they're overwhelmed with the number of they don't have a structured way of doing business because they're a family business, which is also nice. I like that. But it also means that it's a bit disorganized, and they also overwhelmed because they're dealing with a lot bigger contracts and they're like a 1-man or 2-man team, 2-person team. So it's very, I get it. It's sometimes frustrating, but I definitely get it.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so much going on in the cities right now, especially in the middle of this pandemic with the reno. So every time someone cancels, like neither of us my husband nor I are upset at all. We're just like, pandemic, it's just gonna happen. We were also talking about how terrible my internet connection is here in the city. What is it like being in a smaller town or in a village? Like, is the connection still good, or the infrastructure there?
I'm surprised at how good the infrastructure is, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier. In South Africa, a rural village out in the middle of nowhere, if you want to put it like that, would not even have telephone connection potentially. But here, the internet connection is flawless. It really, it's never been a problem. And recently they've upgraded the infrastructure, so it's gotten even faster. We have the option for faster internet. So I might even have better internet than you.
I think you do. Maybe it's just the thing, like there's too many people living on top of me. That sounds weird. But who knows? And so you have, I guess, shopping centers and places to go and whatnot, or would you have to drive the 45 minutes out?
No, we have sort of smaller strip malls out there's 2 towns on either side of us that are a little bit bigger. And by that, I mean about 10,000 inhabitants. And they've got strip malls and all the kind of things that we would need. But even in our village, we still have a restaurant. We have 2 breweries, which are competing breweries, by the way. And in this town, it matters which brewery you're affiliated to. So it's you've got to choose wisely when you arrive.
I've heard of competition between 2 partnering cities like Cologne and Düsseldorf, but never within the village. So that's cool. When I speak to internationals who are moving to Germany, a lot of them would never in their lives ever think to move to a smaller town. So I applaud you for being able to do that and for having the courage to do it. But I think you're the perfect spokesperson for that. And you've been living there successfully for quite a while now. What would be the advantage of an international or for an international to move perhaps to a smaller town?
I think the advantages are the stereotypical ones. It is definitely a quieter and simpler life out here. Our way of life drastically slowed down when we moved out here, even before the pandemic. Now it's a bit different in the pandemic. Obviously, everything's even slower and quieter than it was before. But generally, it's just simpler. There's not so much of a rush that you have in cities. And Sundays here are really quiet. Like even in the cities, I think you still have this Sunday noise verbot or whatever it's called. But here you have it as well. But there's nothing. You don't hear many cars. It's just, it's really, really peaceful. So if that's something that you like, then definitely I would recommend something a bit away from city centers. And also, once you're here a while, I think one of the big advantages for us is the sense of community that you do start feeling, because you go out and you see the same people. You go to the stores, you see the same people. We know the people on our street. We know the people that at the kindergarten with us. I mean, you have that in the city to a degree as well, but it's just more pronounced. I find, out in the countryside, because it's just more of a sense of community. And we know the neighboring kids, like we see them and we're like, oh, that's the kid from whoever. And, so if anything happens or anything going on, we have this amazing feeling of like everyone's looking out for everyone else's kids.
I know back home in Canada, for me, my mom used to send us out to play street hockey with all of our friends, and she'd say, come home when the lights turn on. Whereas I could never imagine in a million years sending my son out to do that here in the city. So was there anything that you've noticed over the past few years of living in a smaller town that you have maybe had to compromise, have had to give up in order to live this life that you wanted on the land?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And these things are always, there's never a perfect situation, like with your living arrangements. You're always compromising. There's always some big things that you have to compromise on. And then definitely you get a lot of benefits living out in the country, but there are a lot of things that you have to give up, and some things that we've definitely missed. And one of the things is, like, if it's Saturday night at 9 o'clock and you feel like a cheeky doner, or you just want to go down the corner and, pick up a burger or something, it's just, you don't have that freedom to say, oh, maybe we want to do this tonight. And then you've got a few options available to you without having to drive half an hour to get them. That's a disadvantage. Something else out here, there is something that we get regularly in spring and sometimes in autumn that the Germans called Landluft, which means country air, is what it euphemistically is, but it's really referring to the smell of manure on the fields or whatever. Sometimes that fresh country air is not so fresh smelling, but it's not too bad where we are, and I've definitely gotten used to it to a degree. But there's always that's always going to be an issue. And the other thing is, you definitely need a car. So that's not an option where we are. There's no train station in our village. So we 100% need a car. So we've got 2 cars. I think the other disadvantage, like I said earlier, it is more difficult to make friends. And I think especially for new foreigners, it's going to be very difficult to make friends out in the countryside. And we've seen that it's something like, people are helpful. As I said, if you run into trouble, they're there to help, but it's difficult to make those connections. And I think that's a disadvantage, because in the city, you at least have other foreigners around you, and you have people who are willing to switch easier to English or whatever language, mostly English.
I also agree that, when you're moving to a new country, even if it's not Germany, you're moving to a new country, I think that the most important thing to do would probably be to jump in, but maybe in more of a city life where you have those internationals around you. And then once you get comfortable with the language and you start to understand, the culture and the way that people behave, and then once you're really, comfortable in the country, I think then might be a better option for you to start looking at moving outwards to the land. And I think it can also be a lot more affordable. And as you said, I also think that sense of community is so nice. And
in Germany, I must say, you don't have to move that far away from cities to experience a more rural or a more country life, if you want to put it that way, because there are a lot of villages around the big city centers that are maybe 15 minutes away from a big city. And there you get a very similar experience. So you don't actually have to move so far away. And I think that's been also one of the important things for us, is we have a lot of friends in cities. I work in Nuremberg, so I work in a city, even though it's not that big. We still get our city fix, if you want to put it that way. Well, we did before coronavirus, but in a normal situation, we're visiting a lot of friends in nearby cities. We make regular trips. I go every day to my job. I think that's also something to consider. If you want this sort of rural type of life, look not so far away from the city, where you still have access to easily get into a city and enjoy a movie at a cinema or something like that. It's just, you can have the best of both worlds. In Germany, we've also got the amazing train system. I know people love to complain about it, but I do love it. And it's so easy. You can really get to the tiniest of towns and the tiniest of villages. And sometimes they're the most charming, the most beautiful, the most, I guess, typical German experience, so it makes it really nice, and definitely a better or a much easier opportunity for people in the long run. Well, thank you so much. I was going to ask you for your tips, but I think that last section there, you gave some amazing tips for internationals if they are interested in moving out to a smaller town area. I'm sure that a lot of the viewers will have a lot to say about this topic, so I'm looking forward to that. I think that every single person watching this has to check
check out Shaun's podcast, The Germany Experience. Of course, I will link that down below for everybody to check out. But I've been listening to them myself too, even though I've been living here for a long time. So I'd say the podcast is for people who are planning on moving here to kind of get ready, for people who are already moving here, who can relate and kind of feel like, oh my God, you know, finally someone can relate to me. And then it's so interesting for Germans as well, because you're learning so much about the way that other people experience your country. So Shaun has got all that and more over on the podcast, so you have to check that out.
And I'm going to hire you as my PR person, because that's a much better description than I could have given. Thank you very much. And of course, Jenna was a guest as well. You were a guest at the end of last year.
I'll link that one down below too.